Good evening. Welcome. I'm Gina Sapiro. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Boston University, and I'm very pleased to welcome here our alumni, our students, our faculty, and assorted other people who have shown up because this is going to be a really interesting talk. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Jon Krosnick, before he talks, but I'll just let you know that he is going to do his talk, and then we'll have question and answer. I'm going to ask in advance that you use the mics. There will be a couple of mics in the room that you can use because we're recording, we're videoing, and we want to hear your brilliant questions so we understand why he's giving the brilliant answer he's giving. So I am really delighted to be able to be here and introduce Jon Krosnick. He is the Frederic Glover Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences at Stanford. He has his PhD from the University of Michigan, received earlier his BA in psychology from Harvard, and his MA and PhD degrees were both in social psychology. Before he joined the faculty at Stanford in 2004, Jon was professor of psychology and political science at Ohio State University, where he was a member of the Ohio State Political Psychology Program and co-directed the OSU Summer Institute in Political Psychology. And that institute really had worldwide effect in what was really a growing and new discipline. So it had great effect, and it was a great summer program. Even the summers he didn't invite me to teach in it. He has taught courses on survey methodology around the world at universities, for corporations, for government agencies, for universities, very much in demand. He served as a consultant to many organizations such as Pfizer Pharmaceuticals, the Office of Social Research at CBS, the News Division of ABC, the National Institutes of Health, and on and on. I'm not going to repeat all of this because we have very nice biographies out there. He has been associated with the American National Election Studies for a long time, which is where we got to know each other best when he was on the Board of Overseers and later became one of the co-principal investigators. The American National Election Studies is the oldest continuing scholarly survey of the American electorate. It goes back to 1948. It has been a major infrastructure project of the National Science Foundation since the mid-1970s. And it's really a project that has made a great deal of difference, and it made a difference that Jon was part of it, because rather than just doing what we all see in a lot of the public press about public opinion, which is you find out what percentage of people said this and what percentage of people said that, and then maybe occasionally you say what percentage of people said this who were highly educated and what percentage who were lower educated. Krosnick and his colleagues and the people associated with these projects really dig in to understand the nature of public opinion, the nature of thought about political objects, scientific objects, and communication about it. And public opinion obviously is an act of communication that mediates between what we understand the public is thinking and saying and how they'll act and what they actually think. And so with that, I'm very delighted that I found out that Jon was going to be in Boston, because taking this ability really to think very carefully and very critically and exactly about how people think, what are their views of policy and policy objects in this very, very important area of climate change. It's important for all of us because the topic is important. It's also important for us at Boston University right now because we are having major efforts in scholarship and teaching, not just in climate change, but much more broadly in the area of earth and climate sciences. We've been doing a lot of work recently to try to bring together our scholars at all levels, not just across departments, but across schools, to be able to have a major impact in this area. And so with that, let me ask Jon Krosnick, who is not just a scholar, by the way, but a musician, a drummer. He is one of the very few people I know who leaves DVDs outside of the room on which he has a few minutes of public opinion and a few minutes of drumming. Jon.
Well, thank you all very much. It's really a delight and a privilege to get to spend a little time with you this evening. It feels very comfortable in at least two regards. One is that, as you heard, I became a social scientist really as an undergraduate across the river here. And so coming back to Boston feels very natural. But also, it feels natural to be here tonight because I realize that I have actually spent my life following Jon A around. It turns out that in phase one, she went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, and then I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan later. And then she ran the American National Election Studies, and then later I ran the American National Election Studies. And then she came to Boston University, and now I came to Boston University. So it seemed really quite natural to have this little sequence happening. So I appreciate your time this evening as I tell you a little story about an adventure that I've been involved in now for about 15 years. In the early 1990s, I was an assistant professor of psychology at Ohio State University, happily typing at my computer about politics. And the phone rang, and it was a phone call from a group called Industrial Economics, a consulting firm based in Cambridge, who said, we're calling to invite you to come to a little conference we're going to hold in Cambridge. It's about global warming. And I said, what's that? I literally did not know. I had paid no attention. And I had no special interest, and I thought, well, why would you want me to come to this kind of, oh, no, it's okay. We're going to bring a group of social scientists together. We'll teach you for the first half a day. We'll teach you about what global warming is all about, and then we'll talk about it for the rest of the 2 days. So, okay, fine. So a group of us went and listened to this discussion, and it became clear that they wanted to fund some research. And so at the end of the 2 days, they said, would anybody here like to have some money to fund some research in this area? So I said, I would. And so that's what started me off in this direction. And really, to me, it was just applying my studies of public opinion and passion about political issues in a new domain. I didn't really care. I could study gun control or abortion or capital punishment. But in this case, sure, I'm happy to study global warming. But as it turns out, it became an addiction for me that I have not been able to let go of over a time period that seems to be going on and will not stop. It's interesting in the sense that for me, my work was really about simply understanding what public opinion is and how it changes and what directs it and what impact it has on the political process. But having gotten involved in the work I'll tell you about tonight, I found myself meeting with senators and congressional representatives in Washington, writing an op-ed in the New York Times not very long ago, getting hate mail, and it changed my life in various interesting ways. So I'll tell you about that little adventure, and in the process, I think, give you maybe some insight into both how we as social scientists study public opinion and understand it, but also what the public thinks about this problem. So let me just acknowledge with gratitude this list of sponsors, government agencies, news media organizations, universities that have provided support for the work that I'll tell you about tonight. A lot of the surveys that we've done have been partnered with news media organizations that make them possible. So to begin, if this will work, it did work before, but that's okay. This is, a little box you can see here, less CO2 in the atmosphere. And many people will tell you they think that's a good thing, that we should try to make it happen. And if you asked a natural scientist, maybe some natural scientists in the room here tonight, how can you make that happen? What would be the causal process and connections that would produce that? They could draw technical diagrams. But if you ask a social scientist, how can you cause there to be less CO2 in the atmosphere, then this is the kind of answer that we might give. It looks something like that. And I'm not going to ask you to memorize this exactly, but working backwards here, there are a couple of ways you can imagine producing a situation of less CO2 in the atmosphere. One is fewer emissions in the future, and secondly, maybe somebody invents a giant vacuum cleaner to suck out what's up there now. And there might be technical steps and legislative steps that would produce those things. To get that legislation passed, the public over here might influence what politicians do, and you might think about messages to the public that would activate the public to do that. And so it's in this context that we're going to talk about what the public thinks and what the public wants. And to put this in some context for you, I want to show you a couple of statements that have been made by observers in this arena. Here, this one, the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, who said, the public has not really understood the issue of climate change very well, nor have they understood the role they play in greenhouse gas emissions. We need a major effort to educate the public. Okay? Or in 2008, just a couple of years ago, in Science, the most prestigious scientific publication, some might argue, the strong scientific consensus on the causes and risks of climate change stands in stark contrast to widespread confusion and complacency among the public. Or headlines more recently in October 2009, some making statements about the public's beliefs about global warming's existence. For example, fewer Americans believe in global warming, or notable drop in America's belief in global warming. Some statements about certainty, Americans more confused about climate, or fewer Americans convinced about climate. Some headlines about concern about climate change waning, or public more complacent about climate change. Or my favorite, the cute ones, U.S. belief in global warming is cooling, or America's belief in global warming cools. November 2010, just a few months ago, the number of Americans who agree the Earth is warming because of man-made activity has been in free fall, according to a publication in Bloomberg Businessweek. So these are all statements about things started out bad from the point of view of the folks who are concerned about this problem, and they have gotten worse, right? That's the story. And so what I want to tell you is about my own investigation into these issues, and I'll signal you now that we don't see exactly what you have heard in those quotes. So we'll talk about where this evidence comes from, what it suggests, and where we might go from here. All of the evidence I'm going to tell you about tonight comes from national surveys done between 1997 and 2010. These are all with representative samples of American adults. Some surveys being done, actually many surveys being done these days, are not done with scientific samples. They're done with groups of people who volunteer to do surveys in exchange for money or prizes. And they are synthesized to look demographically like the nation, but they are not scientifically sampled, and we don't use them for this kind of work. These are all surveys that involved interviews by telephone. An increasing number of surveys are being done by the internet. Really good quality surveys are done as well face-to-face with interviewers in respondents' homes. But to hold all constant here, these are all telephone surveys. The interviewers have extensive training. They're supervised very carefully. And I will tell you that I'm a person who loses sleep at night making sure that question wording is balanced and unbiased. A chunk of my research for quite a long time is on how to write questions so that people understand them and we measure accurately. An important thing for you to know is we don't describe these surveys when we begin the phone calls as being about global warming. You can imagine if I called you and said, hi, we're calling from ABC News, like to interview you about your opinions about global warming. People uninterested in the topic would be more likely to hang up. So we describe the surveys as being about public issues generally to avoid that problem. So today, I'm going to take you through a series of chapters. First, we'll talk about what the American public has been thinking on this issue between 1997 and 2010 broadly. Secondly, we'll get into the issue of this free fall hypothesis. Has there been movement recently? Eventually, we will get around to talking about the 2010 elections that happened not long ago, and you're seeing their effects play out very vividly now in Washington. And I will talk about the role that this issue had in that set of elections, and we will talk about regional differences across the country, a perspective I came to value more recently than I had before. And in that context, I'll tell you about a survey we did not long ago of Massachusetts to compare Massachusetts to the nation as a whole. Okay, so let's begin in part one. To put the survey results in some context, let me show you the results of a content analysis that we did, where between 2000 and 2009, we counted up the number of news stories in newspapers with the phrase global warming or climate change in them in the United States. And you can see that the issue got relatively steady coverage between 2000 and 2005. And the real watershed year was 2007. You could not turn a corner in this country without bumping into some news story about climate change in that year. Keep that in mind because 2007 will be an important year in what we see in the survey results. To start with, I want to show you the results of a very simple question about the existence of this phenomenon. So our question reads like this. You may have heard about the idea that the world's temperature may have been going up slowly over the past 100 years. What is your personal opinion on this? Do you think this probably has been happening, or do you think it probably has not been happening? Okay? So that core question provides these results between 1997 and November 2010, our most recent survey. In 1997, 79% of Americans said that they thought the Earth's temperature probably had been gradually warming. That number is 75% as of November 2010. Now, let's just take a breath for a second. Those are gigantic numbers in the context of American public opinion. That, as you know, on most issues that are the focus of controversy, America is remarkably evenly divided in its opinions. Otherwise, issues wouldn't sustain themselves in public debate. This is not one of those issues. This is an issue where you will see over and over again very large majorities, surprising in this context. We followed that question with a question about how sure people were about their answer to this question, that the Earth had or had not been heating up. In 1997, 44% of the country said that they were extremely or very sure, the top 2 points on a 5-point rating scale. By November 2010, that number was 45%. So you can see a small surge here, and let me just go back and show you here. You can see a small surge here, again surrounding 2006, 2007, but there's really essentially no notable change over that time period. When we ask people if the Earth's temperature has been rising gradually, do you think it's mostly been caused by things people do, mostly caused by natural processes, or caused about equally by things people do and natural processes? And the proportion of people saying either mostly by things people do or about equally by both was 80% in 2006, 75% in November of 2010. When we ask people if the Earth's temperature were to rise 5 degrees Fahrenheit in 75 years from now, would that be good, bad, or neither good nor bad? In 1997, 60% of people said they thought it would be bad. As of November 2010, that number is 56%. And lastly, in this sequence, when we ask people, do you think the federal government should be doing more to deal with this issue than it does now, less or about the same? A little less than 50% supported more government action back in the 1990s. That number rose to 70% in 2007 and sits at about 62% today. So if you think about this set of results that I've shown you, it is already clearly disconfirming two aspects of the quotes I showed you earlier, right? The first is that I think it'd be pretty hard for the natural scientists to claim that the majority of the American public is out of touch with what they think is going on in this arena. In fact, the majority, and in some cases huge majorities of Americans, have believed and continue to believe what the natural scientists have been saying. Secondly, there's no evidence of free fall in any of these numbers during this time period, right? So those are your take-homes. Now, so far, let me just show you that while all this stability has been going on, it's not as if Americans haven't been learning something. When we ask people in these surveys, how much do you think you know about global warming? That back in the 1990s, about 40% of people placed themselves at the top 2 points on this rating scale, a lot or a moderate amount. That number has risen steadily up to the high 60s today. So that onslaught of news attention has brought people more and more information, and yet hasn't produced dramatic changes in their opinions. Okay, that's part one. Let's talk about the decline since 2006. So I want to tell you a little story about other people's surveys before we get back to the story of our surveys on this. And this is the release from the Pew Center on a survey that they produced in October 2009. The headline of their release was this: there's been a sharp decline over the past year in the percentage of Americans who say there is solid evidence that global temperatures are rising, and fewer also see global warming as a very serious problem. When this survey result was translated by the news media into their releases, it became a little bit more catastrophized. Here's an example from NPR. A new poll by the Pew Research Center for the People in the Press shows a big jump in the number of people who doubt the reality, the cause, and the risks of global warming. So here's the Pew result. They said, when we asked our question back in 2008, 71% of people gave a particular answer. That number dropped to 57% in 2009. Now, in 1 year, that's a big jump. We don't typically see that in public opinion research. Something significant has to happen to produce that big of a change. And let me show you that when we asked this question in our own survey in 2010, this number had risen a little bit from 57 up to 62. That's a statistically significant increase over that time period. So this decline during that period from 2008 to 2009 was not unique. In fact, lots of other survey organizations, CNN, Harris Interactive, Fox News, Gallup, and others, reported similar declines in their surveys. But in order to interpret these findings, you have to begin with a truism in survey measurement, which is question wording matters. So we're going to look closely now at the wordings of the questions that produced those results. But first, let's talk about some rules of good question design that come from 100 years of research in social science about communication and survey research. First of all, none of these will surprise you, I'm sure. Respondents respond to the words in the question you ask. The brain can't help but do so. The words that you put in the question enter people's consciousness, and they activate thoughts and produce responses. Secondly, respondents answer the question they were asked, not the question you wish they had been asked when reading a poll result. So you have to pay close attention, not to stand back and squint and say, well, that question sort of asks X, but think really carefully about what is it really asking. Third, use familiar, non-jargony words to express precisely the idea of interest. So don't assume that just because you know what something means that everybody understands it. Be clear about wording. Next, ask about only one idea at a time. Don't ask people if they like baseball games and pizza in the same question. And lastly, ask balanced questions that accord legitimacy to all viewpoints. Don't shove people in a particular direction, like, you do believe the Earth has been warming, don't you? Okay, so in light of those rules, let's look at the wordings of the questions used by some of these other organizations. So we'll start with the Pew question. From what you've read and heard, is there solid evidence that the average temperature on Earth has been getting warmer over the past few decades or not? Looks like a reasonable question, right? But it's got some important differences. First of all, it asks about what people have read and heard. You remember our question asked, what's your personal opinion? Do you think the Earth has been warming or not? This, I think, is more of a question about what people feel they've been reading and hearing. Secondly, it's a question that asks about solid evidence. So that places the bar pretty high, right? You could certainly imagine that people would say, well, from what I've heard, there is evidence. I'm not sure how solid the evidence is. Nonetheless, I look at my garden. It's blossoming earlier than it ever did before. I'm convinced myself, regardless of what the evidence is that I'm reading and hearing. There's a choice made here about the last few decades. Many natural scientists would say that that's too narrow a time frame to capture the phenomena that they see. We will give a little smiley face for the or not, just as an attempt at balance in the question. So, you know, it's a fine question, but it's maybe not asking the same thing that we asked. Here's another one. Recently, you may have noticed that global warming has been getting some attention in the news. Yes? Not clear why you need to start a survey question with that, but okay. Global warming refers to the idea that the world's average temperature has been increasing over the past 150 years, may be increasing more in the future, and that the world's climate may change as a result. Do you think that global warming is happening? So there's sort of at least three things going on here at the same time. You've got the 150-year time frame. What if somebody says, well, I think it has been increasing in the past. I don't think it's going to increase in the future. It might change. It's hard to necessarily find a way to express your opinion cleanly amidst all of those options. Another one. If you had to choose, do you believe climate change is really occurring? Not is it occurring, but is it really occurring? Is it definitely occurring, probably occurring, possibly occurring, probably not occurring, or definitely not occurring? So notice here there are three answer choices on the occurring side and only two answer choices on the not occurring side. not a balanced question. Still another one. Do you believe the theory that increased carbon dioxide and other gases released into the atmosphere will, if unchecked, lead to global warming and an increase in average temperatures? So if global warming is not an increase in average temperatures, what is it? Okay. So, or not, you know, we can smile at that. A very efficient question, do you believe global warming exists? A little bit like, does the Easter Bunny exist, right? Or a very inefficient question, and if you want to have some fun, just close your eyes for a minute and listen to me read this and pretend you're being interviewed over the telephone. You've got to hold this question in memory. Which of the following statements comes closest to your view of global warming? Global warming is a proven fact and is mostly caused by emissions from cars and industrial facilities such as power plants and factories. Global warming is a proven fact and is mostly caused by natural changes that have nothing to do with emissions from cars and industrial facilities. Or global warming is a theory that has not yet been proven. It doesn't even offer the option, global warming is not happening, right? So the point is, wording matters. And so I'm sure it won't surprise you when I show you that, you know, would you guess that all of those different wordings produce the same result? They do not. Here is, in fact, the range of results across a series of questions, these and others, all of which can, by themselves, be looked at as an indication of whether the public believes the planet's been warming or not. So there's a Gallup question that produces a number of 70. These are all, by the way, oh, sorry about the typo. These are surveys done between late 2009 and early 2010. In this Gallup survey, with one of their questions, 79% of Americans seem to be saying they think global warming is real. Here's our Stanford question at 75, and the numbers decline all the way down to another Gallup question, which produced a number at 49%. Now, does this mean surveys are unreliable? Does this mean if you do the same survey twice, you'll get completely different results? No, actually, I've shown you. You do the same survey 5 times, you get the exact same results. This is evidence, I think, that question wording matters. And so you want to pick your question wording carefully. So to go back to our data then, this is the little up and down that I showed you earlier. And of course, this time period here does show a decline. And in fact, the decline is really quite concentrated. There's a 4 percentage point drop from 2007 to 2008. And there's a 5 percentage point drop from 2008 to 2009. This is not 17 percentage points or 22 percentage points. It's very small movement, but nonetheless, it is movement that happened for 2 years in a row. So the question is, what happened here? Why did this occur? Why did the decline unfold? So I'm going to propose to you 5 hypotheses that we explored. The first one is that trust in scientists declined, especially trust in this domain. You no doubt know, I call it here Emailgate, many people call it Climategate. You know that emails that were hacked from the University of East Anglia and released publicly were claimed to have shown conspiracy, unethical behavior by climate scientists trying to suppress the voices of skeptics. There was certainly a front-page New York Times article about it, other coverage that then sustained a dialogue on the internet, on blogs for quite some period of time. And at about the same time, there were reports identified by the IPCC that supposedly had some errors in them, a couple of small errors, a citation of an undergraduate thesis in one case as opposed to peer-reviewed publications and so on. There's a sense in the scientific community of being under siege, a sense in which scientific credibility really had declined. Maybe that contributed to what I showed you earlier. Second hypothesis, the awful economy beginning in 2008 drove down the public's willingness to pay for costly remedial policies. So if the government is going to address climate change and it's going to cost money by putting a price on carbon or whatever, maybe people say, you know, I'm no longer willing to do that stuff. We just can't. And now that I think about it, maybe climate change isn't even really happening in the first place. It's more comfortable to rationalize that way. That's the second possibility. Third possibility, you may know that Republican leaders have been relatively consistent in expressing skepticism about the existence of climate change, much more so than Democratic leaders. It may be that the Republican leaders are finally getting traction with constituents who trust them. Another possibility is that skeptical scientists, a relatively small group of natural scientists who have been very visible in news coverage. One well-known is Richard Lindzen from across the river at MIT. Perhaps those individuals are finally getting traction. I've gotten emails from people to express their belief that that's true over time. And the last hypothesis I want to propose is that 2008 broke the warming trend. And let me just show you what that means. This is average world temperature between 2001 and 2009. And you can see that the lowest year here is 2008. That during this time period, 2008 had unusually cool temperatures worldwide. So is it possible that that decline in world temperature might have influenced what people think? Well, who would use recent temperatures to infer whether climate change is happening? Who would be influenced by that? Well, I want to propose to you there's a way to think about the public as divided into two parts. And one part is a group of people who have no choice but to do that. So if you think about part one as the people who trust scientists, if natural scientists say, look, we've been studying this for a long time, we look at ice cores, we look at melting glaciers, it's happening. And it's been happening for hundreds of years. Then these individuals say, fine, I trust you, I'll accept that. But think about what people who do not trust scientists say. And I will tell you, when I started research in this area, I couldn't imagine that there would be people like this. That in fact, we did focus groups around the country asking people what they thought about global warming. I'll never forget a gentleman in Texas who said, you know, scientists are just like everybody else. They're bought and paid for. Whoever's paying their bills, that's the findings they're going to come up with. And to me, this was preposterous, that I think of science as remarkably self-correcting, remarkably committed to truth, such that if I make a statement that's a mistake, my colleagues will quickly go after it so that our profession will not get caught up going down the wrong pathway. But in this case, this individual and others had a different view of the enterprise. So what is he to do when I ask, do you think the Earth's temperature has been gradually rising over the last 100 years? Well, he can't look to the scientists. And so I would suggest that he has no choice but to figure it out some other way. And proverbially, he might do so by sticking his finger out the window. That he might say, well, what's been happening recently? And as you know, there have been some record warm years recently. But if that trend changed in 2008, perhaps he said, you know what? I'm less convinced now. OK, that's the fifth hypothesis. Now, let me just pause for a quick second to raise a possibility here. Does the season matter when the survey is done? Okay? So if he's literally sticking his finger out the window at the moment and saying, is it hot outside? Is it hot in this room? Might that distort people's judgments of whether there's been world warming over a long period of time? Let me just point out that there is a hint in the data that I've been showing you that might point in this direction. So the 2008 surveys that I showed you and all of the surveys done before that in our sequence were done during the spring and summer. Why? Because most of these surveys were jointly done by our group and some news media organization. And those news organizations don't want to get involved in surveys on a topic unless the public's going to be interested in it. And so they need some hook. And for them, the hook most often has been Earth Day. Happens in April. And so if we can do a poll just before that and they can release that result or just after that, that's the excuse that they need. So that explains why we have a concentration of surveys before 2008 during that time period. When were the 2009 and 2010 surveys done? When the decline showed up? Well, it turns out they were done in the fall and winter. Why would that be? Well, it turns out the hook for the news organizations then was the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change in December of 2009. So might there be a seasonality to the survey results that produced this apparent downtrend? So let me show you the answer is no. So this is an instance in which during the summer of 2007, we did 3 surveys, one in April, one in June, and one in September. April at the end of a colder winter, June when things were hot, in September when things were cooling down again, and there is no change at all in the percent of people who said they thought the planet had been heating up. So you don't need to worry about that. Here's another test of the same thing. During the summer of 2010, we did a survey in June and then one in November when it was a lot cooler, and there is no difference at that time either. So let's talk about these hypotheses. Has trust in scientists declined? Could that explain what's going on? And the answer is not at all. So the first time we asked this question in 2006 in this sequence, 72% of Americans said they trusted scientists who study the environment either completely, a lot, or a moderate amount. The top 3 points on this rating scale. That number is 71% today. There is no meaningful change there. Now, you can cut this up different ways. You can look at just the completely people or the completely and a lot people. It's the same story. There has been no shift. Now, this is a particularly important finding because, as I said to you earlier, the natural science community got in a real tizzy about ClimateGate and about the IPCC report errors. And skeptical voices in the scientific community and in the political world took advantage of those occasions to raise real questions about the credibility of scientists. In fact, Ralph Cicerone, who's president of the National Academy of Sciences, said the National Academy needs to initiate a major effort to convince the public that science is valuable and respectable. And these data say, well, no, actually, in late 2009, nothing went wrong as a result of that revelation. And in retrospect, it's not that surprising because, in fact, it was one front page story on some newspapers in the country. And when we asked people in our surveys, do you remember hearing anything about emails involving climate scientists? Almost nobody actually remembered hearing it. And among the people who remembered hearing about those stories, most of them did not think that it was evidence of scientific misconduct. In order to get people's attention, you need something like what's happening in Japan right now. It's got to happen for a long period of time, and it's got to be rehearsed and discussed over and over again. A little blip like this isn't that consequential. Okay, I'm going to actually skip a little bit here because I just told you what I just showed you. So the hypothesis number one does not do well. Hypothesis number two, has willingness to pay for remedial policies declined because the economy collapsed in 2008? The answer is no, actually not at all. So I'm going to show you here some graphs of the percent of people between 2006 and November 2010 who supported either government requiring businesses or encouraging with tax breaks a series of remedial efforts. For example, requiring energy producers to do so in producing less greenhouse gases, requiring Detroit to build automobiles that are more efficient, use less gasoline and produce fewer emissions, building buildings that are more energy efficient and take less energy to heat and cool, and building more efficient appliances. Approval of these policies was a little above 80% in 2006, and it was a hair below 80% in 2010. There is no evidence of a dramatic drop in 2008 when the economy collapsed. Here's another set. These are questions about tax breaks. So here you can see huge support for tax breaks to utilities to produce energy from green methods, solar, wind, and water. Tax breaks to support nuclear power plants actually increased from 2006 to 2009 from 41% to 54%, although it's been dropping off up until 2010. It'd be interesting to see what happened recently to that. There are two policies that Americans have never liked, actually, that we've been asking about. And these are both policies that one version of economic theory points directly to. So the question goes something like this. Do you think the federal government should increase taxes on gasoline in order to cause people to use less of it? Or do you think the government should increase taxes on electricity in order to cause people to use less of it? And you can imagine when you say, should the government take your money just to manipulate your behavior? It doesn't sound so great to people. So 31% of people supported it in 2006, 33% in 2010, 19% with regard to electricity, up a hair to 24%. So these are not particularly popular policies. But you shouldn't interpret this as evidence that people are unwilling to pay, because they are actually quite willing to pay, as I'll show you a little bit later. So now let's look at the hypothesis that 2008 broke the warming trend. So this is the longer trend. So these are global surface temperatures relative to the average of 1951 to 1980. And you can see it was kind of cool back here, warm here, but here's that little dip I showed you earlier. This is the dip again in 2008. So the question is, are people aware of this dip? So we, it turns out, had been asking a question. We'd been asking people, do you think average temperatures around the world have been higher in the last 3 years than they were in the years before that, lower, or about the same? And for this time period, 2006, 2007, and 2008, this number held relatively steady, the percent of people who said they thought it had been higher. So what happened the next year, 2009, after the cool year of 2008? This number dropped. So some people were aware that the Earth was actually cooler in recent years. So as I told you, who would use this information? Well, it's the people who don't trust scientists. And as it turns out, the high trust people were aware of this decline. This is their recognition of the cooling in 2008. But look how much bigger the low trust people's decline is. So they were very aware that it had not been warmer recently after 2008. So this big drop then sets these folks up. And as it turns out, when we go back to our existence question, has global warming been happening? These are the numbers for the folks who are highly trusting in scientists. They certainly show some decline. But look at how dramatic the decline is among the group of people who don't trust scientists. So as you can see, there's a big drop here during this 2008 to 2009 time period. That looks much more like the Pew result, right? But this is only a small subset of the public. And in fact, they had been declining a bit before that, but they are now on their way back up again. And that's because after 2008, Earth's temperatures have been rising again. So the reason why this dramatic change doesn't translate into huge change for the country as a whole is this is a small group. This is less than 30% of the country. So if you're a scientist, you'll be pleased to know that a large majority of Americans trust you. But that small group whose skepticism increased recently are the folks who are responsible. So conclusions. First of all, large majorities of Americans agree with the natural scientists on the basics of this issue. Secondly, public endorsement of these views did recede after 2006, but it's been holding steady now and rising a bit. And the real change has been among people who are low in trust in scientists, and it's due to their perceptions of changing world temperature patterns. So this is not a situation in which the natural scientists ought to be sounding the alarm bells. That, in fact, it's kind of hard to blame the public, this segment of the public, who feel they can't rely on scientists for arriving at their beliefs the way they've arrived. It's not clear to me how else they could do it. Okay. Now, I'm actually going to skip that little story because we don't have time for that. But I am going to show you this little story, which has to do with what we call the issue public. This is a term that Phil Converse coined in the 1960s, and it refers to the distinction between the general public in a democracy and the fact that for any given policy issue, there are typically a small group of people who are very passionate about that issue. People who wake up every morning saying, another day, another opportunity to influence gun control policy in America. Or another day, another opportunity to do something about climate change. And so it's those folks who are the activists, those people who are thinking and talking and paying attention to what others say about the issue, and they use that issue as a basis for their voting behavior. They are also the activists. They give money to organizations, they go to rallies, they make phone calls, they write letters. And the issue public on climate change has more than doubled since 1997. It was 8% when we started doing these surveys. It peaked at 18% in 2007. It's at about 14% in our most recent survey. That's 38 million adults who are happy to write checks and write letters and go to rallies and make phone calls and so on. And just to put this 14% in some context, you might think, gee, that's tiny. But look at, according to other surveys, the sizes of other issue publics on issues that get lots of attention in public discussion. The biggest we've ever seen was abortion in the 1990s, that was at 30%. But otherwise, the global warming issue public is kind of in about the middle of the pack here. Not atypical, and certainly a large enough group to make itself heard. Now, those are the folks who we think, based on decades of political science research would be using this issue to have voted in the 2010 election, if anybody used it. And let me tell you about some headlines that appeared on the internet after that election. One was, Democrats who took risk and voted for climate bill paid price. Another one, cap and trade didn't kill the Democrats. Or another one, it's not the climate bill, stupid. Or ignoring evidence, Politico spins climate vote as electoral loser. So as you can see, the observers who were quick to offer opinions didn't all agree with each other about whether taking green stands on the climate issue actually had any consequences for people in that election. So what I want to do is show you two types of evidence, and I will tell you that the first evidence we're going to look at is a content analysis of campaign websites. This is in process, so I'm going to show you rough numbers now. When we finish this in a little while, these numbers will change a bit, but I suspect not too much. And we're going to look at whether on the candidates' campaign websites, did they take what you might call a green position on climate change? It's happening, it's a problem, we need to do something about it. Or did they take what we'll call a not green position, that saying they think it's not happening? Or did they say nothing? So first, let's look at the Democrats in the Senate, running in the Senate. 77% of them, sorry, these are percentages by the way, 77% of them said nothing about climate change. 20% of them took a green position, and 3% of them took a not green position. So for the most part, silence. And when I talked to senators and congressional representatives before this election about were they going to actually talk about this issue and how, the message that I got from Democrats was quite consistent. I can't say anything about this. It's a loser. We're in tough economic times. There's no way I can sell climate change as an issue. So this, I think, led to this posture. Turns out the Republicans were almost equally silent in the Senate. 61% said nothing. 6% said something green on the issue. 33% actually did take a not green position. So as I told you earlier, the Republicans tend to be a little bit more vocally skeptical than the Democrats are not skeptical. The same basic patterns in the House among Democrats. 80% were silent on climate, 15% took a green position, and 4% took a not green position. And among the Republicans in the House, 81% were silent, 2% took a green position, and 16% took a not green position. So the question is, did this matter? Did remaining silent, did taking a green position, taking a not green position have any impact? Now, what I haven't told you is that in our survey results, the issue public on global warming is a very unusual issue public. On most issues, gun control, abortion, capital punishment, and others, the passionate group tends to be split about equally between people on what you might call the liberal side of the issue and the conservative side of the issue. But the climate change issue public is a very strange one, that here 90% or more are on the green side of the issue. That there certainly are passionate skeptics. They're not a particularly large group of people, but they're making plenty of noise. And I do, as I say, get emails from them occasionally. But they're not a particularly big group. So if people are going to be responsive to candidate statements on climate, our survey data would predict that being silent is a mistake, taking a green stand would be smarter, taking a not green stand would actually not be a good idea. So let's see first, just in a very correlational way, did the candidates' behavior correlate with their victory rates? So I'm going to show you the percent of Democrats in the House who won separately by what they said on climate. So among the Democrats who were silent, 46% of them won. Among the Democrats who took a green position on climate, 54% won. And among the Democrats who took a not green position, 24% of them won. So these are actually significant differences, and they're consistent with the hypothesis that green gained votes, not green lost votes. Same actually is true in the Senate, as I'll show you in a second, but first here are the Republicans in the House. 58% of Republicans who said nothing won. 60%, no significant increase for them by taking a green position. But among the not greens, there is a significant decline from 58 to 51%, even among Republican candidates. The Democrats in the Senate, those who were silent, 26% of them won. Those who took a green position, 57% won. There actually weren't enough to do that third bar for you. And lastly, among the Republicans on the Senate side, 68% of those who were silent won, whereas only 58%, a significant difference again, who took a not green position won. Now, you being the sophisticated analyst that you are say, oh yeah, but that's all correlational. That it could be that the people who felt they were certainly going to win, they had nothing to lose, were happy to take a green position, and that the only people who took a not green position were the desperate ones who were not going to win anyway. So how can we find out whether actually something has been causing something else here? Well, I'm going to tell you the results of a survey experiment that we conducted before the 2010 election, in which all respondents heard about a hypothetical candidate who we described to them running for the Senate, and we read the respondent either 2 or 3 quotes of the candidate talking about some issue, and then we asked them for each one, after they heard about the issues, we asked them, overall, now based on what you've heard, how likely are you to vote for or against this candidate? So let me show you a little more specifics. So in the control group, where 1/3 of the respondents, selected randomly, they heard quotes on what we'll call 2 control issues, terrorism and the economy. And after they heard each quote, they were asked, do you mostly agree or mostly disagree? Now, the reason we asked that question was as a kind of guise. So we wanted to expose them to these paragraphs, but just reading paragraphs to people wouldn't make sense unless we asked them a question. So we said, do you mostly agree or disagree with that? And then at the end, we said, now, based on all the things that you've heard the candidate say, will you definitely vote for this candidate, probably vote for the candidate, probably vote against, or definitely vote against? So that's 1/3. In the next 1/3, we'll call this the green group, they heard the 2 control paragraphs plus this one. And I know it's long, but let me read it to you so you can hear what this candidate said. This is taken from real language that we saw on candidates' websites. Like most Americans and most of the residents of our great state, I believe that global warming has been happening for the last 100 years, mainly because we've been burning fossil fuels and putting out greenhouse gases. Now is the time for us to stop this by ending our dependence on imported oil and coal to run our cars and heat our houses. We need to begin using new forms of energy that are made in America and will be renewable forever. We can build better cars that use less gasoline. We can build better appliances that use less electricity. And we can make power from the sun and from wind. We don't have to change our lifestyles, but we do need to reshape the way our country does business. We need to end our long-term addiction to polluting the environment and instead let American genius do what it does best, transform our outdated ways of generating energy into new ones that create jobs and entire industries and stop the damage we've been doing to the environment. Now, you can imagine there are lots of different ways you could write that paragraph, right? You could have the energy independence and the renewables in there or not. But this is kind of an amalgamation of the kinds of statements that candidates on the green side were actually making. Here's what the non-green group heard instead. Again, it's sort of a long paragraph taken in particular from one senator's website. There isn't any real science to say we are changing the climate of the Earth. The science on global warming is a hoax and is an attempt to perpetrate a fraud on the American people. Climate science is junk science, and global warming is a manufactured controversy. I don't buy into the whole man-caused global warming, man-caused climate change mantra, and I believe that there is not sound science to back that up. We must spend no effort to deal with something that is not a problem at all. Yet that's exactly what's happening with the cap-and-trade bill that Congress has considered. I oppose the cap-and-trade bill. Cap-and-trade is a job killer and damages our economy. We should not invest in windmills and solar panels as alternative energy sources. Instead, we should continue to focus on our traditional sources of energy, coal, oil, and natural gas. We should expand energy production in our country, including by continuing to mine our coal and doing more drilling for oil here at home. Okay, so that's a point of view that's been boldly offered. So what impact does all this have? What % of people said they would vote for the candidates if they heard the candidates say nothing on climate, if they heard the candidate make a green statement, or if they heard the candidate make a non-green statement? So first of all, among the control group, 65% said they would vote for the candidate. So they, on balance, like the statements about taxes, and, the economy, and terrorism. When you add to that the green statement, that percentage goes up to 77%. Statistically significant increase. And instead, when you compare the control group to people who heard the candidate take a not green position, that number goes down to 48%, a statistically significant decline. Now, we don't want to stop there, right? Because that finding is consistent overall with the story I've told you. But in order to understand where votes can be gained and lost, we'd want to split the voters into Republicans, Democrats, and independents, because you might argue the independents are the people who really matter. Those are the people in play who can be pulled one way or another by what the candidates say. So let's first look among Democrats. I won't do this too slowly because you'll get the point that among Democrats, being green helps and being not green hurts. Maybe not a surprise. Among Republican voters, not much going on here. In fact, this 83 is not significantly different from the 78, but it is significantly different from the 76. So actually, even among Republican voters, being not green hurt a tiny bit. But here's the real story. This is among the independents. So among the independents, big increase by being green and a big decrease, almost 20 percentage points by being not green. Now, the question this brings me to is, who is advising these candidates? Do they want to win these elections? Because given this kind of evidence, which certainly could have been produced by their advisors, it seems irresistible. And in fact, even before you saw this evidence, I think it's an irresistible issue, because there's a group of people, a small group of people, 14% right now, who are paying very close attention to what a candidate says on this issue, and they are 90+% on the green side. You can't usually, as a candidate, enjoy that kind of situation. If on gun control you say you're pro-guns, you're going to lose the support of a bunch of people, about the same number of people whose support you'll gain. And yet, on this issue, there's a lot to be gained. And yet, it was a missed opportunity, I think. Okay, we're coming to the end. Let me tell you one little tidbit, and then I'll tell you about Massachusetts in particular. You can imagine accepting all of the evidence I've presented to you so far, and yet saying, oh, but wait a second. Yes, fine, okay. Americans think it's happening. They think it's going to be bad. They want government to do something about it. But they think it's much more important for government to devote energy to lots of other more pressing problems right now, that it's an issue of priorities. So if you wanted to make that case, there's a particularly famous survey question that you could draw on that's been asked many, many times since George Gallup developed it in the 1930s. It asks, what is the most important problem facing this country today? Almost in exactly that wording, many, many survey organizations have asked that question over a long period of time. And when we asked it recently, and when lots of others have asked it over a long time period, global warming comes in last. Basically, I put a little bar here just to show you I didn't forget about it, but this is basically zero, that nobody cites global warming when they answer this question. Now, most recently, not surprisingly, in 2009, the #1 problem was the economy, and by a large margin. And so it's this kind of evidence that leads people to say, look, Americans place no priority on this. Sam Larson, who's an undergraduate at Stanford, said, you know, I'm not so sure that's really a fair way to look at it. That, in fact, if you look closely at this question, is it maybe a little bit of a narrow telescope, in the sense that, first of all, it's only asking for one problem, right? Can government work on more than one thing at a time? Yes, probably. But it's asking for only the most important. And then it's asking only about this country, and it's only asking about today. Is it possible that Americans take that to be a question asking them to cite only problems that face this country and not other countries, and only problems that are currently pressing? So Sam said, well, what if we asked it a different way? What if we said, what will be the most important problem facing the world in the future if nothing is done to stop it? And you can imagine lots of potential answers: terrorism, population explosion, and maybe climate change. So we asked this, and here's what we found. In this one, global warming and the environment come in first place. So you say, oh, but wait a second. Yes, people answer global warming about the future, but Americans are much more parochial. They don't actually want their government to be working now on problems that are going to face us in the future, and especially not problems that the rest of the world is going to face as well. They'll take care of it. So that's the social loafing idea that other countries will solve it. We don't need to deal with it. Let's just focus on our problems right now, like the economy, for example. Maybe. So we asked, this question. How much effort do you think the federal government in Washington should put into dealing with the serious problems the world will face in the future if nothing is done to stop them? And the answer is that the percent of people who said a great deal or a lot, the top 2 points on this rating scale, is 76%. This is not like 30% or 20% or 10%. This is a big number. People want our government to be working on problems that will face the world in the future. So I think it would be a mistake to say that Americans do not place priority on this problem. So just to give you some quick conclusions of this little part of the talk. First, silence on climate during the 2010 elections, I believe, cost some candidates some votes. And taking not green positions in 2010 actually cost even more votes. And let me now tell you very quickly, to conclude, about regional differences in Massachusetts in particular. Okay? And we're going to do this very fast because I can show it to you in a kind of blinky way. I'm going to show you some maps of the country that are presenting the percent of each state that express the point of view that the majority of Americans expressed. So how many people think the planet's been heating up? How many people think it's been caused by humans? How many people think it will be bad? How many people want government to do more? And I will tell you, when we stacked up all of our national surveys to produce many thousands of respondents and then broke them up into the states, so we had enough respondents in each state to actually produce a number for that state, we almost never found an instance, in fact we found only one instance, in which one state on one question had a majority of their residents taking the not green position on the issue. Across all the states, all the questions, all the analyses, majorities always took the green position, but those majorities ranged in size from the low 50% to the high 90%. There were some instances in which huge majorities took those positions. So I'll show you just very quickly. Here's the question about, has the Earth been heating up over the last 100 years? The smallest majority was 63%. The largest majority was 99%. Here's a graph that 69% was in Kansas. The darker the state, the bigger the majority. Look at this one. This is one of the darkest states. And this is where Senator Inhofe is from, who I sort of quoted earlier in that not green statement. He's certainly been the most outspoken Senate skeptic on climate. And most of his constituents are on the green side of this issue. North Dakota just has an X because there are not enough people for us to actually, in our survey, to make a statement. Not that we don't like them. Is it caused by humans? The majorities range from 64 to 99%. This is the one instance where, when we asked people, should government do more, less, or the same, this is the one case where the majority was less than 50, and that was in Idaho. The next smallest was in Missouri at 54%. Okay, so let's do Massachusetts and we'll call it a night. So in July of 2010, we did a survey of 600 respondents in Massachusetts. And these slides you can understand really easily, okay? There's going to be two bars. I'm going to show you, the left-hand bar is the percent of all Americans who expressed a point of view, and the right-hand bar is going to be the percent of Massachusetts residents who expressed that same point of view, okay? Pay attention, see if you can get the pattern. Ready? Here's the first one, 74-84, 45-48, 75-80, 64-73, 81-85, 14-15, 59-66. You get the pattern? 76-77, 84-85, 48-38. Not so positive about nuclear power plants here in Massachusetts. 22-26, 20-17, 74-77. You want to talk about that? Yeah, I didn't show you this earlier. 74% of Americans favored cap and trade, 77% of Massachusetts residents do. And let me show you now, lastly, when we look at, now this is Massachusetts only, I don't have a national comparison for this exact question. We describe to people a policy, oh shoot, this is an important typo. This is 85% here. So, sorry, I hardly had any typos otherwise. We asked people, would you vote in favor of or against a policy for the federal government to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2050 if it cost your household $100 or $150 or $200. Respondents were randomly assigned to one of these numbers. Okay? And what we see is that 66%, so, by the way, this is $100 every year between now and 2050. So 66% voted in favor at $100, 56% voted in favor at $150, and 53% voted in favor at $200. So the point here is, first of all, you see the expected decline in willingness to pay as the price goes up. But secondly, the Congressional Budget Office puts the actual cost of doing this at about $147. So a majority of folks in Massachusetts, and as it turns out, a majority of Americans, are willing to vote for that price. Many people are willing to pay even more, and even larger numbers are willing to pay less. If you had graduated payments across people, you could cover this cost with their willingness to pay. Okay, so this is the last thing I'm going to show you. This is when we replicated the experiment on voting in the 2010 election. By going from silence to the not green statement, the candidate gained 10 percentage points, which is almost exactly a match of the 12 percentage points that I showed you gained for the full national sample. Okay, whew. So we've gotten through all the data. Conclusions at a broad level. Those quotes we started off with tonight, they're just not right. The public actually does understand the basics of what natural scientists have been saying about climate. They accept those statements. They endorse government action on this problem. They recognize it to be a threat and do place priority on it. And in fact, enough people attach significance to it that it is a consequential political force. But I hope not only is all of that clear, but that in our little time together tonight, I've also given maybe some of you a deeper look than you've had before into how social scientists ask and answer questions like this, how we do surveys, how we analyze the data, how we interpret the data, and how small methodological differences, including wordings of questions, can make big differences in the conclusions we would reach. And so I hope in the future, as you watch the way the public's views on this issue evolve, that you don't stand back and squint, but you actually turn to page A27 so you can actually read the survey question wording. And if it's not there, don't stop there. Go to the website, click on the link, and find the wording so you know what to make of it. Because that will help you know what a finding really means. And I hope that being in touch with what the public actually thinks will help us all to understand the world we live in and perhaps help our government to move forward into this democracy as well. Thank you very much for your time. Questions? We have a microphone that would like to be in front of you.
Hi, I have two questions. One, how are you guaranteeing that you have representative samples given the decline in landlines? Particularly given how long you've been doing this and the changes.
Yeah, let's stop there for a second.
Okay.
So the question is, for those of you who are farther away, how can we guarantee representativeness of the sample given the decline in landline households? Easy. Call cell phones. That's what we do. Did you have another question as well?
Yes, I did. The second question is, are there any questions at all in these surveys about people's willingness to change their behavior? Not just pay more for gas, but a conservation measure.
Yes. So I want to say 2008. Sorry, thank you. The question was, have we asked at all about people's willingness to change their personal behavior, which I assume means buy a Prius, bike more, change the light bulbs, take vacations in the backyard instead of flying to Fiji. In 2008, we did ask a series of questions on this. And I believe the number was in the high 70% range of people who said they were changing their behavior. They were doing a variety of things to reduce their carbon footprint more. And when we asked people, why are you doing this? Are you doing this to save money, or are you doing it to help the planet, or both? The majority of people said either to help the planet or both. On the other hand, the majority of people said to save money or both. And so it appeared that lots of people are doing things. At the same time, there are lots of aspects of our results that suggest that Americans recognize this to be a global problem, not a personal problem. And that just as we talk about the idea that, you know, if you vote in the next election or not, it's going to have no meaningful impact on the outcome of that election. If you change your light bulbs or not, it's going to have no meaningful outcome in terms of the planet, with one little footnote. That James Fowler, who's a political scientist at University of California, San Diego, has been doing interesting research suggesting that my wife actually has been right for a long time. She says to me, I explained to her how elaborate theory shows that I don't need to vote because it's not going to affect the outcome of the election. She says, you're going to vote because imagine if everybody didn't vote. And the truth is, according to James's work, that actually voting is contagious to some degree. If you put that little badge saying I voted, that you can actually in your social network inspire others to do it. If you change your light bulbs and you bike more, you might inspire others to do it. Little seeds like that might produce effects, but that's not a dominant view that Americans seem to endorse according to the surveys. Nonetheless, lots of people seem to be doing green things.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah. Presumably, politicians, you must have talked to some of them and presented your results to them. Why have they been so timid and not reacted in the way you would expect and taken the green position?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I can't answer it completely, but I'll give you two different kinds of answers. The first is after I wrote, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times back in June of 2010 that was really essentially the message that I've given you here today. And I kind of got to the point where I thought, somebody's got to say this, or the public debate is going to move over in this free-fall direction without a corrective. So when I published that, Stanford's posture was, you know, we want outreach. We want our faculty to be disseminating their findings. So they set up a series of meetings with me, with senators, their staff, congressional representatives, their staff, committees, and so on. And so I had the opportunity to sort of have this discussion. And so I sat with them, and they said, what are your findings? And I described them. And they said, oh, well, that's, you know, very nice, but that wouldn't work for me. You know, I know, you know, we know that blank state is different from the country as a whole. And so I said, oh, really? Oh, I would love to see your polling data on that, because, you know, I'd be surprised if it was really that different from what we have. And to a person, they said, oh, well, we don't have any polling data because, well, you know, we don't need to collect any polling data on this. We're focusing on things we can talk about. So there is some sense in which their failure to collect the data was one problem. But all of the surveys I showed you have gotten a fair amount of press. And when people stand back and squint, that reinforces this skeptical idea. So one perspective might be the lack of this kind of work being on their desks failed to inspire some candidates. But there's another explanation as well, right? Which is that it may be that other forces drive what candidates are willing to talk about, depending upon who's giving money to their campaigns, for example. So we are now involved in an analysis to look at the relationship between the outcomes I described, what the candidates said, and the contributions that they received from various industries. So we'll see where that gets us. What do you want? Okay.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. So a follow-up question to that last one, because there seems to be a disconnect between what's happened in Washington and what you claim the voters really want or believe, because support for a cap and trade and other things, both in Pennsylvania Avenue and in Capitol Hill, has collapsed. I mean, it has imploded. And so I wonder what's going on here. And I think it's connected to those two questions that you pointed to, where one said, what is the most important problem facing the country today? Global warming doesn't show up. What about when you ask a future-oriented question? It's very high, but the real question is, where do those two questions rank in people's priorities? That is, you know, I don't think people, even though when you ask them about the future, they think about global warming, but most people don't care about the future, I think. And so it really is a question of, you know, what's the most pressing problem today, and those are going to rank higher than future-oriented questions. So I'm wondering if you talk about how those questions relate to each other.
Yeah, well, I think you're right to suggest that. I showed you that result earlier, right? Let me just remind you. It's a lot of slides back. Sorry. I showed you this result, that 76% of Americans said they wanted government to devote a great deal or a lot of effort to future problems. So it isn't that they don't care, but your point is right. What I didn't ask was the comparable question about current problems. I could have said, how much effort do you think the federal government should put into dealing with the serious problems facing the United States today? And that would presumably have been 100% in that case. I guess maybe we don't need to ask it to know. And so you might then say, okay, well, let's do a real ranking here. Let's talk about all the problems government could be working on now that are current problems and all the future problems and rank them all together. And absolutely, I think that's a reasonable way to go. I guess my gut is that if we really looked at what Washington is doing, not to mention Sacramento and Boston and state capitals, that Washington is working on hundreds, if not thousands, of problems and putting significant effort into them. And so, is it really a competition for the top 4 spots or the top 20 spots even in order for government to do something, particularly when, as you know, some of these arguments are being made about energy independence, where you have collateral benefits from certain directions to move in. So, if we were to ask people to rank, how important is it for America to not be relying on the Middle East for its primary source of energy? We could get into other ways of looking at this problem. So I think you're pointing to a really interesting direction, and we could do much more on priorities.
Let me just push a little bit on that. So my point is this. If people, maybe the politicians know that, yes, people have, they believe your numbers, but maybe the politicians think and know that even though Americans, believe, even if that number's correct, that in the scheme of things, what's really important when push comes to shove, what they're most interested in are things pressing today. And so even though you get this big number, maybe politicians, I'm just speculating, but maybe politicians kind of sense that and know that even though those numbers might be correct, that it doesn't have a lot of weight in the overall scheme of things.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely true. And at the same time, we might say, well, okay, so those are that you're painting a picture of a politician who's trying to be faithful to his or her constituents. And if you think about another vision of politicians that says, well, the main thing that they worry about is getting reelected, those results speak in a different direction, right? Okay.
Oh, hi. First of all, thank you for the presentation and the work that you're doing. And I like that you started it by saying you kind of didn't have any axe to grind in this and that you're very neutral in this and that you're a social scientist and et cetera. My question is, one of your slides was related to this hypothetical experiment where you had kind of a long text and you tested both theories, and they didn't seem to be balanced to me when I sort of stepped back and squinted at it. One seemed to be related to on the positive green side, all this great things that green can do for the world. And on the other side, it was more geared towards how skeptical are you of this? And so I just wondered what methods you have to make sure that it's balanced.
Right. Well, I think you're making an excellent point. Which let me focus on that for a second, then I'll answer your question. So your illustration is really of the fact that there are many different versions of a green message that could be written and many different versions of a not green message that can be written. And that if we were to do this experiment again, changing them, we could find out, is there a way to present the not green message that's not so damaging, or maybe it's even positive? Is there a way to present the green message that's actually negative rather than positive? So that would be a really interesting direction to go in, to see whether people react differently. Now, one possible version is that people are reacting to the little details of the message, because it's a long message, there's a lot of details, and that slight changes in the text could make a big difference in how people react. Another possibility is they're just reacting to either it's green or it's not green, and all the other decorations aren't really going to drive much of what they think. So we could discover that. But let me answer your question more directly by saying, Actually, we didn't seek to write two versions that were balanced in any way. What I tried to do was to, on the one hand, read the websites from the Green candidates and capture what they said, and read the websites of the not Green candidates and capture what they said. So in some sense, it has what psychologists call ecological validity. It looks like the world looks. But that doesn't mean it's the only possible version of that experiment we could do, and it'd be fun to do more.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. We're apparently rotating sides here.
With your data that suggests that the independents are swayed by a green politician, do you have any predictions for the upcoming elections in 2012? And do you see a public opinion changing if you were to see a lot of green candidates in 2012? Would that change? How do you think that would change public opinion on the global warming?
Well, yeah, so that's a really interesting question. Let me answer your second comment first. So you're raising the possibility that if candidates talk about the green position, that it might actually change what the public thinks on the issue. And I think that's possible, but isn't it interesting that I showed you these surveys going back 15 years, and there's been almost no change in net public opinion over that time period on so many things that we measured. You know, the Al Gore movie came out. No impact. Millions of dollars were spent on ads to try to convince the public to become green. No impact. The thing that seems to have mattered is the earth changed. You know, you got to actually change the world in order to change public opinion a little tiny bit. So the idea that candidates taking green positions might push the public a little bit more in that direction seems very plausible to me, and yet I hesitate a little bit about it just because so many other things have happened that haven't pushed the public around very much. So that's one answer. A second answer to your question is that you saw this past week that President Obama made a speech on energy and brought that issue back alive at this point. I don't see that as a risky thing for him to have done. And you know, it may well turn into a legislative battle, but in terms of public opinion, that doesn't strike me as a risky move to have made. Does that foreshadow other candidates talking about energy on the green side in particular? I don't know, because I don't have the sense, I don't know that the consultants in Washington are advising the candidates to move in the green direction. In fact, you know, my op-ed was in June 2010, before the 2010 elections. So I don't think I have any impact either, really.
Thank you. Jon came in last night on the red eye, I understand, so on the principle of sustainable energy, I think it's time to stop. Before we finish, let me thank the Department of Political Science and the Department of Geography and Environment that supported this, and Luis and Caitlin, who did all the organizing and helped put it together. Thank you very much for doing that. So stay tuned. We are going to continue to study these matters. If weather matters for people here at Boston University, we know we live in Back Bay. We know that if the oceans rise, we're going to need fins. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Jon.
Is there a website where your materials?
There is. Yeah,
Yes.
there's a website at Stanford. You can find it easily.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Good night.